There are two readings, and the first one is Zechariah chapter 9, verses 9 to 13, the coming of Zion's King. Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, daughter of Jerusalem. See, your King comes to you, righteous and having salvation, gentle and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. I will take away the chariots from Ephraim, and the war horses from Jerusalem, and the battle bow will be broken. He will proclaim peace to the nations. His rule will extend from sea to sea, and from the river to the ends of the earth. As for you, because of the blood of my covenant with you, I will free your prisoners from the waterless pit. Return to your fortress, O prisoners of hope. Even now I announce that I will restore twice as much to you. I will bend Judah as I bend my bow, and fill it with Ephraim. I will rouse your sons, O Zion, against your sons, O Greece, and make you like a warrior's sword. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. And the second reading is Mark 11, chapter 1 to 11. As they approached Jerusalem and came to Bethphage and Bethany at the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent two of his disciples, saying to them, "Go to the village ahead of you, and just as you enter it, you will find a colt tied there, which no one has ever ridden. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks you, 'Why are you doing this?' tell them, 'The Lord needs it and will send it back here shortly.'" They went and found a colt outside in the street, tied at a doorway. As they untied it, some people standing there asked, "What are you doing untying that colt?" They answered as Jesus had told them to, and the people let them go. When they brought the colt to Jesus and threw their cloaks over it, he sat on it. Many people spread their cloaks on the road, while others spread branches they had cut in the fields. Those who went ahead and those who followed shouted, "Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. Hosanna in the highest." Jesus entered Jerusalem and went to the temple. He looked around at everything, but since it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Father, I pray that the words that I speak this morning will be your words, and that all our thoughts will be your thoughts. Amen. So what do you think of Elizabeth? Not my Liz, who's away at a wedding today. Not Liz Slater, who's one of our band leaders. But what do you think of Elizabeth II? It's her Diamond Jubilee year. I'm sure you've all heard of that. Very few kings and queens make it this far. And that's, I guess, one of the advantages of being a queen in a constitutional monarchy. The king doesn't have to lead the troops from the front. No chance of being killed in battle. Most of you have only known the one monarch. So it's going to be a little bit difficult for you to say whether she's a good queen or a bad queen. But anyway, what do you think? Is she a good queen? Yes? What could she have done better? I'll leave you with that one. In the passage for today, we see the crowds making yet another attempt to install Jesus as their king. So I thought it would be a good idea to take a look at some kings and queens and see what they were like and whether we think they would make an ideal monarch. I'll start with a list of 4 who I think are good kings, and I'll tell you very briefly why I think each one is a good king. It's not a history lesson. Edward I, for his reforms of the criminal law, which are just about still the basis of most of our criminal law today. Elizabeth I, who had a very conciliatory approach to the feuding Catholics and Protestants in the land at the time, and established the Church of England. So we're all here. Her reign is still seen as something of a golden age. Henry VIII, I bet you weren't expecting him. Henry's energy in the early part of his reign was responsible for setting the framework for Elizabeth's golden age. Richard I, Richard the Lionheart. He was a brilliant military leader, and he was commanding his own army at the age of 16. Now for some bad kings. Can I guess what the first name on your list of bad kings might be? John, yes, King John. Probably the top of everybody's list of bad kings, having tried to usurp his brother, but he was also known to be petty and spiteful. Charles I. He had such a strong belief in the divine right of kings that it led to a fatal split with Parliament. It resulted in the English Civil War, which he then lost. George III, who was so focused on war with France, and I'll give him this, he did have Napoleon beaten, but he was so focused on war with France that his attempt to raise taxes from the colonists led to the loss of the American colonies. And finally, Henry VIII, whose flagrant disregard for his own laws and the church's laws led him to behead his wives. His concern was to produce a male heir at the expense of just about anything else. So there we have 7 monarchs from our history. You may or may not agree with my assessment of them as good or bad kings. That's rather irrelevant. All of them had some good qualities. But what would an ideal king be like? Here are a few ideas. Wise like Solomon. Strong like Richard I or Churchill. Decisive. Fair like Eadwig the Fair, who reigned from 955 to 959. Proactive like Henry VIII. Dutiful like our own Elizabeth II. Charismatic like Edward I. Someone who's a natural leader like Charles I wasn't. Merciful like Richard I. Someone who is subject to his own laws. Any other qualities you might like to see in a king, an ideal king? I've left 3, I think, fairly obvious ones out. Would anybody like to show? Trevor? Being a Christian. Well, that would be an interesting one. Yes, that would be very good. And I think we've got one of those at the moment. So think about that when I say something later. Tim? Humility, yeah. That would be good, wouldn't it? Somebody who doesn't lord it over people. And perhaps I've got one down here that's the opposite of that you might like as well. So I've got 3 other things that I was hoping somebody might shout out. John? Somebody who inspires love. Yeah, definitely. Definitely like to see that in a king. I've got 3 other words down here. Gracious. Sure. Sorry? Integrity. Yeah, definitely integrity. All right, I think that's enough now. Gracious. That's, I think, in the national anthem, isn't it? God save our gracious Queen. Magisterial. Someone who knows how to be a king and how to look like a king. And glorious. I think that's in the national anthem as well, isn't it? Yes. So what would it be like living under a king? Well, for us, I guess it doesn't make very much difference. Although perhaps when Charles III sits on the throne as the defender of faith, not the defender of the faith, we might see some differences. But I don't think it's going to affect our daily lives that much. In Jesus' time, of course, the king, the ruler, had quite an influence on the daily life. They decided if there would be war or peace. Many wars have been fought solely to satisfy a king's pride. They were nothing to do with the security of the nation and had nothing to do with anything else, just to make the king feel good about himself. If there is to be a war, then there would have to be money raised, and that means all of you and me would have to pay extra taxes. That would certainly affect our everyday life. If the king came to visit, he would have to be given the best room in town. Yes, given. Even Elizabeth II doesn't carry money. And if the king asked for anything to be done, however bizarre it may sound, it would have to be done for him. The Jewish nation desperately wanted their own king. They had been conquered many times, which is not something that you or I can easily understand. They were currently part of the Roman Empire, and the taxes that were raised from the Jewish people went off to support things in Rome. Worse than that, though, the rules that the Romans imposed on them meant that their own religious ceremonies were affected, and they weren't allowed to practice their religion the way they would have liked to. They looked back to the reign of King David, when they had defeated all their enemies and everything was well with the kingdom. Isn't hindsight a wonderful thing? If you read the Old Testament, you'll find it wasn't quite like that. There were huge crowds around. Jerusalem was packed. When we come to the Olympics later this year, we'll have a bit of an inkling of just how much an impact a huge crowd has. Probably not so much out here, but if you go to London, you'll definitely notice it. There were huge numbers of visitors. People everywhere. They've come to remember that time when Moses freed the people from slavery in Egypt and took them out into the promised land. They were looking for a repeat performance from someone, from anyone. They were hoping for a miracle cure. A cure that would see the nation restored to its former glory, at least to independence and self-determination. This time, though, they were not going to run away. They wanted the Romans kicked out. It's at this point that Jesus decides to demonstrate who he is. He clearly signals to them that he is their king. Remember the reading from Zechariah? Verse 9 of chapter 9 says, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, daughter of Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and having salvation, gentle and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." All the Jews knew their scriptures. They could not possibly miss that sign. They recognized their new king immediately and began praising him. They grab anything they can and wave it in the streets. Did you take these off the hedge as you came in this morning? For your garden, right. Well, they would have just taken it from the nearest hedge or tree. And that's why we have palm leaves, because there were quite a lot of palm trees around. They would have just grabbed whatever they could from the fields and waved it in the procession. They used their cloaks as a red carpet to welcome their honoured guest. For someone this important, even the donkey must not walk on the dusty, dirty road. The donkey, by the way, is a symbol of peace and humility. And Hosanna, which is what they were all shouting, means save. And it had become an expression of praise, a recognition perhaps of the fact that God has saved his people so many times through their history. The praise and expectation were high. John's account tells us that the crowd who had seen Lazarus raised from the dead were also there, shouting praises to Jesus. And that the story about Lazarus spread throughout the larger crowd. A prophet who could raise the dead was something that they hadn't seen since Elijah. Jesus enters the city and then moves on to the temple. He enters the temple and takes a look around at everything. That's odd, isn't it? Jesus had been there loads of times before. But he's planning what to do next. Tomorrow, he will purify the temple. For whatever reason, and there are many theories, the crowd will turn on Jesus and reject him as their king or as their Messiah. Now, I don't know what theory you particularly take. One says that he turned the wrong way. He turned towards the temple as he went through the gate rather than to the administrative area. And so they realized that he was going to sort out the temple, not the Romans. After his death and resurrection, his disciples would see that he is, in reality, King of the world, not just King of the Jews, a title given to him by the Roman Pilate, by the way. His followers would recognize that as King and Saviour, Jesus has a special call on their lives. As his followers, we should also recognize this. Projectionist, if possible. Who is it? I can't see. Matthew. If possible, can we have... Oh no, sorry, that's the wrong little note. We'll come to that one in a minute. That note is about your will be done. We should recognize that we are living under an absent king, but we are still to do his will, as they said in their prayer. Don't interrupt me, Lord, I'm praying. It's a sketch that I've heard before, and it's really very good. And we saw it this morning, and they were talking about your will be done. Just what does that mean? How do we respond to living under a king? The way we respond is for his will to be done. But we're not used to living under a king. It no longer has any meaning to us in our culture. So I've got some questions, which I have to admit I nicked from Tom Wright, so apologies for that. But we'll see how you respond to these. Are we willing to follow the king's orders, even when it's a puzzle to us? Well, in Isaiah 55, verse 8, it says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." Trying to interpret what God is saying can sometimes be very difficult. So if it's not unbiblical, if it's not unethical, then do your best to follow it. But it's going to leave you wondering how you're going to answer the question, why did you do that? But God will bless you for following his way, and the question will most likely not get asked. Are we ready to go out of our way to follow him? In today's world, a commitment to attend worship every Sunday can seem peculiar, even fanatical. Worship is reserved for celebrities and sports stars. Some of them, the real fans, the fanatical ones, will go and see their team every week, if it's a weekly sport. Most of them don't. Jesus was a celebrity in his procession to the temple, but the crowd soon turned on him. Celebrity can be fickle. As a king, he asked that we put aside one day each week, and we spend that day not doing our regular work, but we dedicate it to him. We use it to prepare ourselves with him for the week ahead. That's the day when we get together to worship him. If that's hard, supposing the king were to ask you to travel to a foreign land and live there among its people so you could tell them about him. Here are a few quotes from a guy called Eric Liddell, who I expect most of you will know from the film Chariots of Fire. He was a runner in the 1924 Olympics, and he refused to run on Sunday. So they rearranged the race for him. After the Olympics, he went to be a missionary in China. Here are 3 quotes. One word stands out from all others as the key to knowing God, to having his peace and assurance in your heart. It is obedience. Happiness is to have enough for the day's needs, with always some to spare for those who have not. The kingdom is where the king reigns. If he is reigning in my heart, then the kingdom of heaven has come to me. I wonder what our equivalent of cloaks are. In Jesus' time, most people would have owned just one cloak. I had a look in the cupboard the other day. I think I've got 6 coats. That just gives you a feel for how different our worlds are. It was their only outer garment for protection against the cold. And here they are, laying their cloaks on the ground to honour the king, not considering the cost. Perhaps our nearest equivalent to that is our car. Most of us only have one. Most of us need it for some reason. What would it take to make you put your car at risk? Because that's what this question is really about. What are you prepared to put at risk to honour God? How many of those folks do you think got their cloaks back? Because I bet there were a few opportunists in the crowd. And how many of them got them back without any damage? There's a cost to trying to honour the king. Has our God become domesticated and trivialised? Is he just a helping hand through the tough times of life? Now, projectionist, this is where I really need your help, Matthew. Can we have the Welcome the King of Kings chorus up, please? I think it was the second song, if I remember rightly. Welcome the King of Kings. Great is your name. You come in majesty forever to reign. If we really sing that and really mean that, then God can't possibly be domesticated and trivialized. He must mean more to us than that. My very final thought, which I will leave you with. Are we more concerned about living like a king, or are we more concerned about living for a king?